Dragon's Dogma is an open-world hack-and-slash action-adventure role-playing game from 2012, developed by the same team at Capcom that had previously worked on games in the Resident Evil and Devil May Cry series. Dragon's Dogma takes inspirational elements from both of those series, with its take on more Western-styled fantasy RPGs blending some of the darker, more survival horror elements of Resident Evil with the highly physical intensity of Devil May Cry's more stylish combat. Those are both fun enough qualities that make Dragon's Dogma stand out from some of its competition, but one of the things I really like about it is how it handles its open world design. I'm fond of open world games in general because I'm an avid explorer in pretty much every genre of game, and open world games obviously emphasize that aspect with abundant opportunity. But I also enjoy that greater feeling of agency that comes with having the freedom to choose your own path through the game world and how you'll engage with all of the game's content, which makes every person's experience feel somewhat unique since no two players will ever go to the same places and do the same things in the same order. And yet, I find that some open world games are a little too big and spread out for their own good, or else fill their world with too much shallow, repetitive content, which can make me lose interest and start to feel bored after a while. In some cases, it turns an ordinarily compelling gameplay experience into a dull exercise in time-wasting tedium. Dragon's Dogma doesn't fully escape from some of the pitfalls of open world design, and in fact it has some notable flaws that I'll get into later, but it does some really unique things that you don't often see in other open world games, and certainly not in this combination, which makes the open world of Dragon's Dogma one of the more engaging ones that I've ever experienced, and certainly one of my personal favorites. The big thing is that Dragon's Dogma makes exploring the map feel like an actual journey, in the classic sense of old-school fantasy literature and RPGs, where the journey to reach your destination is meant to feel like an arduous task with a sense of epic grandiosity, based on the hardships you had to overcome and the burdens you had to endure to achieve your goal. This is not a world meant to provide you with a fantasy playground to have fun, whimsical adventures in. It is a place of inherent danger, full of deadly creatures of all sizes, where even the landscape itself is out to kill you sometimes, and where the sheer passage of time is an adversary to your livelihood. The open spaces of the world aren't just there to spread out the major locations and give everything a larger sense of scale, but also to emphasize the wear that your party sustains the longer your journey takes you away from the safe confines of the city, with the ever-pressing threat of even more dangerous conditions if you don't make it back before nightfall. One of the ways it accomplishes this is by making the time of day really important. The game follows a day and night cycle where things get really difficult after dark. Certain types of regular enemies are more active at night, meaning you have to face higher numbers of those enemies, and other, more dangerous enemies spawn at night, which includes zombies rising up from the ground and ghostly spirits who can only be damaged by magic. Besides that, your visibility also drops to practically zero as it becomes so dark that you can only see a few feet in front of you, and even then, only when you have a lantern stocked with oil. This makes it easier for enemies to ambush you since you can't see them coming as easily, and it also makes just navigating the terrain more treacherous since you can't move around as quickly without running the risk of falling off the edge of a cliff that you couldn't see until it was too late. Your lantern can also get temporarily extinguished if it gets doused with water, or permanently extinguished if you just run out of oil. So there's a legitimate risk of being stuck trying to find your way or battle enemies in complete darkness if you aren't careful about your surroundings or aren't properly supplied when you leave town. It's genuinely kind of frightening exploring at night, and it becomes even more tense when you're on an escort quest through uncharted territory where you have to keep your charge safe for the duration of the journey. You might, for example, take a shortcut hoping to spend less time while out in the wilds at night, or to avoid tough enemies elsewhere you've spotted on the other side of the road, and begin to hear loud, heavy flapping noises of something flying in the air, only to discover as the creature finally enters your lamplight that you've just stumbled into a f***ing dragon which you are woefully unprepared to battle and couldn't see ahead of you to know to go around it. It's worth pointing out here that enemies in Dragon's Dogma do not scale to your level, and there are enemies of varying difficulties spread throughout the map and even interspersed in close proximity to one another, which is part of what makes the world feel so dangerous and what makes a leveling system compelling so that you can get stronger to actually face these more difficult enemies. And exploring at night means even tougher enemies are going to be out and about, with such low visibility that it makes you even more likely to run into these difficult enemies that you may not be able to survive against. So for the most part, you really don't want to be caught outside of town after dark, which means leaving for your quest at the top of the morning and trying to finish everything and be back in town by nightfall. If you try to do too much in one trip, or get sidetracked by too many little detours, or spend too long fighting too many enemies, then you run the risk of making things much harder for yourself later in the day. Compounding on this issue is the fact that damage you sustain progressively lowers your maximum health until you're able to rest in a bed, or spend limited healing supplies. Every time you take damage, your maximum health gets lowered slightly, with enough cumulative damage eventually capping your health at 50%. The white bar indicates the amount that can be healed through curative magic, which is essentially free healing as it only costs stamina and, of course, casting time. This applies to your party members as well, who are all AI controlled based on behaviorally learned inclinations, but they can even die permanently, or at least until you can return to town to summon them from the rift again, if they're knocked out and you can't resurrect them in time, or if they get knocked off a cliff or something. This can be especially problematic if, say, you're deep in a dungeon and your healer gets thrown into a pit of death, forcing you into a difficult decision to either continue onward hoping you can survive the rest of the dungeon without your healer, or else hope you can push onward and find a shortcut, or just give up and go back to town to summon your healer again. On long journeys or in prolonged fights against more difficult enemies, you can find yourself beaten down to a point that it's simply too difficult to continue onward, in which case you may have to consider turning around and heading back to town to regroup and recuperate. And even then, you may find yourself ambushed by a griffin, which creates an incredibly tense and exciting situation where you're desperately running away and trying to make it back to town in one piece while low on health, with no healer, and while heavily encumbered by the weight of all the stuff you acquired while looting the dungeon, which actually slows your movement speed. Everything you carry has weight to it, including healing items that will allow you to heal past the lowered limit of your damaged health. So there's a physical limit to how much you can carry in total, but there are other practical restrictions on how much you would actually want to carry in the first place. Heavier equipment loads make you literally move slower and expend more stamina, by as much as 33% in the case of movement speed and up to 300% in the case of stamina, which obviously has an adverse effect on your combat prowess if you can't move fast enough to position yourself properly in a fight, or find yourself too exhausted to fight or run away from some of the bigger, tougher enemies. And of course, you can expect to find more items, equipment, and materials on your journey, so the more weight you carry out from town, the less capacity you'll have to haul new stuff back. The longer your journey, the more stuff you acquire, and the slower and more exhausting your journey gets. So the game incentivizes you to carry as little as possible to be at your best physical condition for combat, while also incentivizing you to stock up as much as possible to extend the limits of your physical longevity, thus instilling an element of strategic balance to how much equipment you'll actually carry when you set out from town.
Too many possessions can be more a hindrance than a help.
This ties back into the time of day, with heavier equipment loads causing you to move more slowly, which makes it harder for you to complete your quest and get back to town before nightfall. The game also uses a limited form of fast travel that forces you to deal with the consequences of these progressively compounding factors more persistently, since you can't freely warp back to town in an instant to get out of a difficult situation once you find yourself over-encumbered, low on health or healing supplies, or on the cusp of nightfall. The fast travel system is based on single-use fairy stones that allow you and your party to warp to any place with a port crystal, which initially is limited to the ones outside of the Pawn Guild in town. But as you explore the world and complete quests, you can acquire port crystals of your own to place anywhere in the overworld, thereby creating your own teleport network based on the hotspots you want to be able to get back to quickly. This is an interesting twist with the extra strategic customization it adds to the equation, in addition to making you earn the ability to teleport. But the limitation is that there are only a few of these port crystals to place in total, and you won't have access to all of them for the first chunk of the game. In fact, you won't even have access to fast travel at all until you reach Gran Soren for the first time, so you'll still have to rely on good old-fashioned footwork to get around the bulk of the map. And you can't teleport at all inside of dungeons, which, as a brief aside, all feel genuinely unique with different types of environments, enemies, and layouts, which is yet another positive aspect in the game's favor. The fairy stones, meanwhile, are single-use and can be fairly expensive to buy, especially when playing the original version of the game before the Dark Arisen expansion rebalanced the cost, so it was cost-prohibitive to use a teleport system on a regular basis. You therefore had to be strategic about when you actually wanted to teleport, at least until you got to the point where you'd earned enough money that you could afford to start using those stones more liberally. So the teleport system ensures that you'll actually have to engage with the world design in person, as opposed to just perpetually skipping past it all. But the world is actually pretty fun to explore thanks to its relatively compact size and complex level designs. The world isn't anywhere near as big as Skyrim, for example, which came out about 6 months earlier, but it still manages to feel big thanks to the way it plays with perspective, where areas that are actually relatively close manage to look really far away when viewing them in person, or that seem like they might only be a short trek away when viewing them from a distance, but then seem to take forever to actually reach. The map's physical composition contributes to this feeling too, with it using more linear paths and obstructions to force you into more circuitous routes to reach different areas of the map. Even when a quest marker doesn't seem like it's that far away on the map screen, it's still surprising when it winds up taking you a solid 30 minutes to get there, between the long route you have to take, fighting enemy encounters and looting chests along the way, dealing with the environmental hazards, and just figuring out where to go in general. You see, the game uses Fog of War, a mapping technique that obscures the visible area of the map screen until you actually explore it for yourself. So unless you've played the game before or are looking up completed maps online, you won't actually know how to get to your destination. You'll have to actually commit effort to exploring the map to figure out where to go, since different pathways can lead you in completely different directions.
The road splits here. Let's be doubly sure of which will
Care to find out where this path leads?
While certain routes may be filled with dangerous enemies that you might want to take a detour around. Sometimes areas of the map will even throw in extra obstacles, like a persistent fog of war that won't clear explored areas until you destroy a thing in the environment masking the area, or strong winds that physically push you around the map, or falling rocks that could inflict serious damage if they hit you, or deep rivers that could cause you to become soaked with water if you choose to cross them, which increases your vulnerability to ice and lightning attacks, or which might even be filled with flesh-eating monsters if you wade into water that's too deep. Enemy placements and treasure chests are likewise placed fairly densely across the map, so there's usually something to engage with just a short walk away, without having to walk a half mile across a completely empty landscape to reach the next thing worth doing. All of this combines to make the world design more of an active component in the gameplay, with more mechanical systems affecting the ways in which you're able to interact with the world as part of the challenge in overcoming its design. And that's something that I find really compelling, as it creates more meaningful impact to every little thing you do in the open world, including the moments of inactivity where there seemingly isn't a lot actively happening within the gameplay. Because even when you're walking down the road with nothing much to really see or do along the way, there are still meaningful consequences happening around you, since you're still spending time to do so, which will count against you later on when it gets closer to nightfall, and you have extra meaningful decisions to make with regards to whether you'll stick to the road or try to find a shortcut to save time, or whether you'll stop to fight monsters or loot stuff along the way, which will likewise take up more of your time, in addition to possibly wearing down your maximum health or healing supplies before reaching your ultimate destination, in which case you might possibly choose to take the long way around, thus sacrificing time in order to preserve health and healing supplies for later. It even matters if you decide to sprint or not, since sprinting will save you time, but will leave you vulnerable if you stumble into an ambush and find yourself too exhausted to defend yourself or run away. And these are just the basic mechanics adding extra depth to all of your actions all by themselves. Then you've got the Fog of War and fast travel system that make you engage with the world as an actual obstacle to overcome, with interesting level designs that take actual effort to figure out your way around. So when you get a quest marker on your map, you don't just mindlessly aim yourself in that direction and then hold down the W key for a few minutes until you get there. There's so much more going on that keeps you engaged in what you're doing at every step of the way, with potentially lasting consequences that will impact how things play out along the way to completing or perhaps failing your journey. That's certainly not to say that the world design in Dragon's Dogma will appeal to everyone. For as much as I love the extra tension and gameplay complications that comes with exploring this world, someone seeking a more casual, laid-back fantasy adventure experience may find managing these extra variables a tedious impediment towards enjoying their time in the game. Fun is subjective after all, and struggling against these types of punitive systems may not be everyone's cup of tea. But speaking as someone who likes to be challenged in the games I play, that's something that really works for me in this case. But even then, Dragon's Dogma does have some serious flaws that bother me. For starters, some of the very things I just praised have some issues. Namely, the idea of progressively reducing your maximum health as you take damage is undermined by the fact that common healing items can heal you past your reduced limit, so it really isn't that difficult to overcome the negative penalties of accumulated damage, especially since you can pause the game and heal back up to full health in an instant from the menu screen. That's something I really dislike and wish had been done a little differently. I wish, for example, that consuming a healing item involved some type of animation time, or that it at least gave you a slow regeneration instead of happening all at once, so that you have to play more defensively and find an opportune moment to heal, and that common healing items would still only heal up to your reduced maximum, while reserving full healing to rare and more expensive healing options so that you actually have to live with the consequences of reduced health more. Personally, I like to play without using any sort of healing items whatsoever, instead relying only on natural healing from magic, just for the sake of challenging myself, which I find to be a decent workaround for this limitation. But it does take self-restraint to play in this way to prevent the healing system from becoming too easy, which is something I wish the game mechanics could have enforced better than me having to do it myself. Secondly, the limited fast travel system that I just praised is undermined quite a bit when the Dark Arisen expansion, which is pretty much the only version of the game that you can buy since it came out, straight up gives you an infinite use fairy stone as soon as you make it to Grand Soren, so there becomes no consequence whatsoever for using the teleport system. And if you choose to ignore the Eternal Fairy Stone and just rely on the same old single-use fairy stones that you can buy from shops, the prices have been reduced to around 10% of what they cost originally. So even by trying to handicap yourself by sticking with the old system, it's still much easier to justify using the teleport system now than it was originally, to the point that it's practically no hindrance to your wallet whatsoever to buy as many fairy stones as you might want, in which case you may as well just use the Eternal one anyway. It's also a little too easy to just carry a port crystal with you everywhere you go so that you can drop one right at your feet wherever you might be, as long as you're in the overworld and not in a dungeon, so that you can warp back to town to drop off inventory, upgrade your skills and equipment, rest up, and then warp right back to where you just were and pick the port crystal back up again with basically no consequence, effectively nullifying the long-term consequences you're meant to sustain from a long journey in an instant. Those port crystals are somewhat heavy, so it does weigh you down a little bit to carry one around like that, but it's not that much of a hindrance. I try to avoid doing this, but frankly the temptation is too great to ignore sometimes, so this is another instance of something I wish had been handled differently so that it was more restrictive than it actually is. Additionally, a lot of the environments themselves tend to look a little bland and just not visually appealing to look at. Some of this can be chalked up to being an older game from 2012, but other games from that era have more appealing visual styles, with more striking variety, so in this case I think it really comes down to the art direction being a little too realistically bland in places to draw you into the world as much as it could have. That by itself can make the world just a little less interesting to explore in some cases. It's also a bit of a bummer that there's effectively only one city in the entire game, and although it is pretty large and filled with a lot of characters who follow daily routines, it feels oddly lifeless in certain ways, like with how many quests are picked up by just grabbing notices off a bounty board or by approaching people with exclamation points over their heads. It maybe also has to do with just how many NPCs and how much space in the city exists to make it look large without really being used for any quests or gameplay purposes, which makes a lot of it come off like set dressing to make it look like a large bustling city without really feeling like a large bustling city. Then we've got the fact that it uses set enemy placements with respawn periods of just a couple days, which does get dreadfully tedious fighting or passing by the same exact enemies in the same exact places every time you go through an area. So here it might have helped to use dynamic respawns so that it isn't so predictable as to what enemies you'll encounter when and where. Although, to be fair, part of the late game does involve farming materials from certain types of enemies in order to craft upgrades and things, so it does help in that regard to know exactly where to find a particular enemy and how long you'll have to wait for it to respawn, so the upgrade process becomes a little more deterministic. But farming enemies in a single-player game of this nature is perhaps not a particularly desirable gameplay loop in the first place, and the advantages that come with fixed enemy placements with regards to farming may not be enough to offset the extreme tedium of all the early and mid-game repetition. Part of me also wishes the save system were a little more restrictive, since it's pretty easy to save before and after every fight to ensure the best possible outcome. If a party member or escorted NPC dies, for instance, you can just reload the save and do the fight over to avoid the penalty you just suffered, unless it's a rare instance when the game immediately autosaves afterward. So this is a situation where I think it might have been good to not include manual saving whatsoever, and instead use some kind of alternative checkpoint system so that you have to live with the consequences more persistently. But then again, that might make some of the tedious repetition of encountering the same enemies in the same places even more obnoxious if you're dying repeatedly and having to go through those same motions every time. Maybe the solution would be to tie manual saves to rare, expensive items, sort of like ink ribbons in Resident Evil, so that you had to be more selective about when you save the game outside of town, or perhaps take an Elden Ring approach by putting fixed shrines around the world that you would have to visit anytime you wanted to save outside of town. There may be other issues I'm overlooking, but that should serve as enough example that the world design in Dragon's Dogma isn't perfect, and indeed has lots of room for improvement in the sequel, which is due to release pretty soon. But despite those flaws, it still does a lot of really interesting things that you don't see in other open-world action-adventure RPGs, which make it a uniquely compelling experience. There are, of course, other compelling aspects that make Dragon's Dogma absolutely worth playing, like its combat system, which has a lot of weighty physicality to the way attacks connect, with climbing on top of enemies and targeting specific body parts to cause specific debilitations against enemies, effectively blending the methodical precision of games like Dark Souls with the intense hack-and-slash action of Devil May Cry or God of War, with a hint of Shadow of the Colossus thrown in for good measure, or how the class system allows every vocation to equip 6 active abilities and swap between a dozen more, which enables a lot of fun build variety, with even the option to switch classes and play as hybrid vocations or take passive abilities learned from one vocation and apply them to another, so there's extra depth and variety that way. Or how the party system uses really innovative AI-controlled pawns who learn techniques and behaviors based on what they observe happening around them, with you getting the chance to shape their behaviors and hire other players' customized pawns to join your party, where they might have advanced knowledge of certain areas, monsters, or quest solutions that they can share with you to aid in different ways outside of just their raw combat stats. Or all the cool details with how your character creation actually influences the gameplay in a significant manner, like for example with taller characters being able to avoid getting soaked when wading through water but not being able to fit through smaller spaces, or how female characters will be able to interact with the Heaven's Peak bandits but will be targeted by ogres who go into a frenzy at the sight of women, or the insanely deep and complex dungeon environments that come with the Dark Arisen expansion, which crush all other dungeons and all other open world games of this sort, or how the main quest and story go into some really interesting territories near the end with an actually exciting dragon fight and an entire post-game sequence of events that really cranks up the story in a fascinating way. But those would be topics for another video, or perhaps a full review, which I frankly may not get around to, and this video is meant to focus specifically on the world design, so I just wanted to briefly touch on them here to highlight some other reasons that Dragon's Dogma is one of my favorite open-world action-adventure RPGs, and why it's absolutely worth playing if any of this stuff sounds appealing to you. It really is a solid game with lots of excellent ideas that was unfortunately cut well short of what it was originally intended to be, supposedly amounting to only 40% of what they had planned due to extreme budget cuts and time constraints from Capcom. So for as good as Dragon's Dogma turned out, it's pretty astounding to think about what it could have been with more time and budget, which leaves me hopeful for what they might be able to accomplish with the upcoming Dragon's Dogma 2. They've got a pretty good blueprint to follow already with easy areas for improvement, so there's potential for the sequel to be just as good, if not even better. And if you haven't already played the first game, then now may be the perfect time to jump in and give it a whirl.